Good morning to everyone. Good to see you today. Getting some rain, and weather's a little bit cooler today. Yesterday, also awesome. Lots of sunshine. We got out on the disc golf course yesterday, so that was cool. Haven't been out on the real golf course yet, so that's kind of disappointing, but we'll get there at some point. And of course, it's baseball season, not just for the Major League Baseball players, but also for some of us younger people. Not me, I'm too old, but the boys are on the team, and Coach Doyle and I are coaching Josiah and Simeon's baseball team. And we're working hard, and we're getting better. We've had a couple of heartbreakers to start the season, but I think those wins will be coming soon. But as a coach, it's interesting how much of baseball happens between the ears. Like, yeah, we use our bodies, we're trying to hit a ball and throw it and stuff, but a huge percentage of baseball is about the mental aspect of the game, the psychology of it. And it's really interesting as a coach to watch, 10 or 11 different kids, even some from the same family, and stand in the batter's box and to see and watch the psychology of the person as they're hitting, how they face adversity, how they face disappointment, how they face failure, which is what baseball is, failure all the time. The best players ever, get a hit 3 out of 10 times. It's not a lot of success, but we have one kid on our team. Standing in a batter's box against the pitcher, that could be a very intimidating situation for you. And we have one kid on our team, and man, I would bet $1 million that I think that as he stands there, he is smiling in the batter's box every time, every pitch. He's smiling, he's enjoying it, he's like living the dream, he loves life, and he is like the most comfortable person in that situation ever. It's really interesting. We have other kids on our team who are just terrified to be in the batter's box. Like, if I could be anywhere else, please just let me do it. You can see the weight of the world on their body, and they're afraid. And they're not just afraid of getting hit by a pitch, right? They're afraid of what's going to happen if they mess up, if they fail, if they don't get a hit. They're afraid of what will happen. So there's, joy, there's fear, there's terror. But watching kids as they fail, as they miss the ball, swing and miss, as they strike out, that's the most fascinating thing, the response to that. And some kids are really hard on themselves. They haven't even struck out yet. They have one strike. They missed a ball swinging. And they just get so down on themselves. They're so hard on themselves. They're like, oh, come on. I'm so bad. I'm not good at this sport. And it's really interesting to think about where that comes from. Now, I know what that is because that's what I was too when I was a boy. So I'm really familiar with that. It's the worst one, of course. That's how I turned out to be, the worst one. And but there's this deep sense of inadequacy that you try to cover over with this perfectionism. Like, oh, I'm so bad that I can't even hit this ball, and you get down on yourself, and you're trying to fight against your sense of inadequacy with that. And at the root of all that is this word that you're not surprised to hear because it's been around this morning: shame. Shame. There's a sense of shame, a sense of worthlessness that comes with failure, or it can, in the sport of baseball. And shame is this universal emotion, right, that we all experience. And there's and we all have to deal with it. And some of us internalize it, like these baseball players, like I'm talking about. You internalize the shame and it destroys yourself. Or you kind of try to externalize and project your shame onto other people and it destroys them instead. You can, scapegoat them or whatever we do with our shame. But we're all having to deal with some level of shame. And it's almost foundational to the human experience. Almost, I say almost, because it wasn't there in the very beginning. It arrives afterwards. And we're going to talk about that today. Hebrews 12, as we read this morning, says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame." Translation we read earlier today, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And then it says, "For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Now, the Hebrew writer here could have said any number of things. He's talking about the central thing that's happening at the cross. And he says Jesus goes to the cross and endures the cross because of the joy set before him, and he despises and scorns the central function of crucifixion, which, to our surprise in the West, is not pain. A lot of times when we tell the story of the cross, we talk about the pain that Jesus experienced. We even have the word for excruciating pain, right? And that's kind of a tradition in our culture, in West in general. Like, we want to make sure that Jesus is like the action movie hero, Jesus. And he goes through all the pain, and he looks like Sylvester Stallone or Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. That's what it was when I was growing up. I don't know what they are anymore. But that's not what the Hebrew writer says. It doesn't say despising the pain, overcoming the pain. He talks about shame. Because that was the function of the cross. The cross existed, crucifixion existed to bring about public humiliation, to bring about public shame. That was the purpose of it. And the cross, then, of Jesus is meant to address this function of crucifixion in first century Roman world, which addresses, not surprisingly, one of the foundational issues, or almost foundational issues in humanity itself, which is shame. So you see the power and the genius of the cross, that it is hitting right at the center of who we are as humans, and Jesus endures that, and he despises that for us. The cross addresses the problem of human shame. Now, I'm not saying that all shame is bad. Of course not. There's a certain kind of shame that the cross is addressing, but it's not trying to get rid of all forms of shame, right? Some forms of shame are good. The Hebrew writer himself is going to use a form of shaming to make these people kind of put on their boots and get to work as being Christians and stop being wimps about it. There's nothing wrong with that. Shame, when we're growing up, what does our mom say to us? Shame on you. Well, there's a reason for that. Some shame is meant to be good, okay? Some shame is healthy. Some shame is helpful. Some people in our culture, probably me included, need a little more shame in our lives, right? That's why we say, "Have you no shame?" Remember that phrase? There's this one guy that in the kids' school pickup line, there's like the line of cars with the parents in the car waiting for the kids to come out. Then there's the parking lot where other parents park, and they get out of their car and they walk up and go get their kids. Both of them are overflowing. There's not enough room for all this. And in the very front, there are 3 handicapped parking spaces. And every single day, this one guy, this one parent, drives his blue car and just like whips through the parking lot, parks in that handicapped spot, gets out of his car, goes and gets his kid, takes him out, 5 minutes early before everyone else drives away. Doesn't have to deal with all the annoyance of the traffic and congestion of the parking lot situation. Well, in my opinion, he could use a little more shame in his life. That's ridiculous. And if he had some shame in that situation about it, he would actually be helping facilitate better relationships between me and him, between him and the people who actually need those parking spaces. So there's a positive form of shame that actually leads to better relationships. If he had shame in that situation, everyone would be better for it. Society would be better for it. And you can extrapolate that and think about, is shame in this situation making my relationship better, facilitating better relationships between us and God? That's positive shame. But there's also obviously a negative shame that is being addressed here. And negative shame is the one that inhibits or destroys or breaks down relationships between humans, relationships between us and God. That's the one that I think Jesus is addressing on the cross. And that's the one that we see way back here in the beginning in Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3. Now, we don't have to read the text, but if you remember the story in Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3, the last verse of Genesis chapter 2 begins, and it begins this whole section of Genesis 3. It says, the man and his wife were naked and they were not ashamed. Remember that verse? The man and his wife were naked and they were not ashamed. Now that introduces the whole tree narrative, okay? That's the verse that sets the stage, and it's about this word shame. And I'm telling you, if you start using the words that are present in and around the text to tell this story, it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes we import words that aren't in the text and tell the story in a little bit different way, but this is a story about shame. That's what the text says. And the very next verse says that the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field. That word for naked and that word for crafty, if you read them in Hebrew, they look exactly the same. Can't tell the difference. This is what the author is trying to show here. There's a play on words between arum and arom. These two words that look exactly the same in Hebrew. Arom, the humans were naked and not ashamed. But the serpent was more crafty, arum. So the craftiness of the serpent is going to attack the nakedness of the humans in this story. And it's a story about shame. And that's precisely what happens. You know the story. The serpent comes to the woman, and he wants there to be doubt, a question in her mind about God and what he thinks of her. And by the end of the conversation, she's wondering if God has even told her the truth about this situation, about this tree, about this garden, about their relationship. And she's asking the question that, I'll use the word that David Tucker said today, worth less. She's asking, am I worth less than I thought to God? Am I worth lying to? Is that my value? Is that what God thinks of me? And that, of course, is what she concludes. And the thing that she's already had with God, this relationship, ends up being the thing that is broken. And what is God's response? He goes looking for them in the cool of the day, and they hide. They hide behind the tree, it says. And God's calling out for them, where are you? And their response is, well, we heard you coming in down the path, and we were afraid because we were naked, and so we hid. And God's question is, who told you that you were naked? You can hear the pain, the disappointment, the grief in his voice. Who told you that you're naked? And all of us live that story in our lives. In a literal way, in a spiritual way. I mean, my kids used to run around our house naked. They didn't care. Now they don't do that anymore. Why is that? We're all wearing clothes here today. Why is that? And the most interesting thing, I think, is that this whole story about the tree and the fruit, this is an upper body story. They're using their hands and their mouth and their eyes and their mind. But those aren't the parts that they're covering with the fig leaves. There's something profound about the place where shame exists the most. And it's the part of us that is the most vulnerable and most intimate. That's what they cover. God said, who told you that you're naked? This isn't a story about anything. I'll say it a different way. This is a story about shame. And at the end of the story, in chapter 2, the fig leaves are removed, and the story says that God put animal skins, gave them animal skins to cover their nakedness. And I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this guy he said, you tell me what those animal skins are for, who they were for. Was it so that God could feel more comfortable in the presence of human sin? Or was it so that the humans could feel more comfortable in the presence of God? He concludes the latter. This wasn't so that it could make God more comfortable, like, oh, you're naked, I can't look at you, please put on some better clothes. Those fig leaves aren't working. God gives them these animal skins so that they can feel comfortable in his presence because of the shame that they are now experiencing. And this shame, as we see in the story, creates enmity and brokenness between the humans themselves, between the humans and creation, between humans and God. The relationship is changed because of this sense of shame. It's the negative kind, the kind that destroys, that inhibits. And God is trying to do everything he can early on here to address that. But of course, ultimately, that story finds its climax in the cross of Jesus. And in the cross of Jesus, we know that he says from the cross, into your hands I commit my spirit. That's the text we read today. What is the opening verse of that psalm? It's about shame. It's a prayer that the psalmist might not experience shame in his situation. And then a couple lines later, into your hands I commit my spirit. Why does Jesus quote that from the cross? Because it's a psalm about shame, and he's experiencing the most horrific shame on the cross that anyone's ever experienced. That's what the Hebrew writer is trying to get us to understand in chapter 12, that Jesus is dealing with this fundamental situation, the problem of shame. In Romans chapter 1, we can read this text here together on the screen. In Romans chapter 1, Paul opens what is the greatest book ever in the Bible, and maybe one of the greatest pieces of literature that humans have ever created, the book of Romans. And even he can't avoid this comment about shame. I used to have Romans in my Bible. Yeah, there it is. So this awesome introduction, right, about the gospel of God and Jesus being declared the Son of God and all this stuff. And by the time he gets down to verse 16, Paul, remember who Paul is, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Greek. For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Why would you be ashamed of the gospel? Isn't the gospel something good, something positive? Why would you be embarrassed about it, ashamed of the gospel? What is he talking about there? Well, number one, no, the gospel wasn't that awesome in the first century. It was kind of a weird story, and it wasn't a hero story, and it wasn't an action movie hero story. It was a story about someone being shamed and humiliated and dying on a cross by the hands of Rome. It's not a power story. It's the story of humiliation. And Paul, in his theology, is trying to show how it actually is the power of God. That's the great irony and reversal of how the cross functions in the cosmos. So there's the part about the story itself. It's probably not too impressive to people in first century Roman Empire. Story about a guy who got crucified. Probably don't want to base your life around someone like that. But for Paul himself, there is the potential to experience shame as he is called to preach this gospel. And the questions that he has in his mind must be the same as Eve. Am I worth less? What is my value? He's done so much to hurt and harm other people, to hurt and harm God. Pretty much anyone in the world is more qualified than Paul to do this stuff, to go around, to preach the gospel, to be a missionary. What a horrible person, a horrible example that he is. He has cause for great shame. And I know that feels like, and maybe you do too. I've done a ton of stuff in my life that I'm not proud of, that I hope none of you ever find out about. And to stand here every week or to run into someone at the grocery store and try to be a Christian and preach the gospel, you run into the shame problem. And Paul ran into the shame problem. I'm not worthy of doing this. I hope someone else talks to this person. I'm not a good example. I'm worthless. I've messed up so much in my life. I'm not a good witness, example, representative of the gospel. But Paul can stand there and he can write this and he can say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God. And whatever I've done, this gospel addresses that. It addresses that shame. Jesus addresses all of that shame on the cross. And that's the reason why I can stand before you. Chief of sinners, Paul calls himself. But so what? The gospel doesn't, there's this old phrase, God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. He makes you worthy. He will qualify you. You don't have to fulfill any requirements. And he can help you despise that shame, just as Jesus did on the cross. And so Paul invites all of us to be able to say this phrase, to be able to live out what Jesus overcame and conquered and addressed on the cross, this universal experience of shame that we have in life. And he calls us to do the same thing that he has, to not be ashamed, to despise the shame as Jesus does, and to say, whatever I have been, whatever I still am, God is at work in me. And I can stand before anyone and give praise to Jesus and tell this story. And I'm not ashamed, not at all, because it's the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. Let's stand and sing.